Hello, is this on? Hi, yeah, is that better? Keep talking, yeah. Okay, hello. Thanks everyone for coming and welcome to Welcome Collection. My name is Alice and together with my colleague Harriet, we lead the Hub, Welcome's dedicated transdisciplinary research space up on the 5th floor of this building. For those who may be here for the first time, Welcome Collection is a free museum and library exploring health and human experience and part of Welcome Trust, which supports science to solve the urgent health issues facing everyone. The Hub Award bridges these two missions by supporting resident research teams over 2 years to explore experiences of health through culturally grounded, transdisciplinary research, bringing voices and expertise to bear on some of our most intractable problems. And this is my moment for a little bit of marketing. I just wanted to let you know that in 2024, we will be launching the next grant call for residents of the Hub. So keep an eye out for that if you or your collaborators are interested in this form of transdisciplinary working. So the Land Body Ecologies Festival is created by our current Hub Award grant holders and the first international residents of the Hub, Land Body Ecologies, who are exploring solastalgia and the relationship between mental health and environmental change through the experiences of indigenous and land-dependent collaborators in Uganda, Kenya, India, the Arctic North and Thailand. So we're really delighted to be hosting the festival and to have this brilliant panel here today as part of the programme. I just wanted to say before we kick off that this conversation will touch on mental distress and themes of suicide. So please take care and take time out if you need to, and staff will happily direct you to the exit and to the chill out space on the first floor if that's something that would support you. And I'll now hand over to Fiona Harvey to chair the event. Fiona is an award-winning environment journalist for The Guardian. Prior to this, she worked for the Financial Times for more than a decade. She's reported on every major environmental issue, from the Arctic and the Amazon, and her wide range of interviewees include Ban Ki-moon, Tony Blair, Al Gore, and Jeff Immelt. Thank you to Fiona and to our panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here today. We've got a fantastic panel here for you, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. We're going to talk about the climate crisis and how it's been a failure in terms of communication. We really haven't managed to tell people clearly enough what the climate crisis is, how it works, how it affects them, what we need to do about it, and really equip them with what they need in our changing present. Not future, but present. And that's a really important issue because, you know, I've been writing about the climate crisis. I've been an environment journalist for almost 20 years. And when I started writing about this, it was all about, you know, how things were going to change, you know, in decades' time. But what we're seeing is the climate crisis happening in real time all around us right now. We're seeing, you know, it's a very hot day today, but we're seeing heat waves around the world. We're seeing a massive heat wave in the sea at the moment off the west coast of Ireland, which is completely unprecedented. We've seen heat waves at both poles simultaneously. We're seeing record temperatures in all sorts of places around the world. We're seeing floods, we're seeing droughts. There's the floods in Pakistan, the droughts in the Horn of Africa. All of these are evidence of the climate crisis all around us. So how are we communicating that? It's almost like it's going too fast. These impacts of the climate crisis are going too fast for us to communicate. So we really need to get our skates on in this. And what I'd also like to get from our panel here is the sense of the many different ways in which we can communicate climate and health. Because it's not just about, you know, the jobs of people like me, journalists who sit and write stories or who talk to television cameras about what's happening. This is about communicating it in people's everyday lives. You know, people talking to each other, using creative means of expression, using art and drama and so on. How we communicate climate and health is really essential now. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists, first of all, briefly, and then I'll go to each of them in turn, give them a chance to talk about what they're working on, and then we'll have a brief discussion, and then we'll bring you in. So be ready with your questions. This event is being live streamed as well. I'm afraid the live streaming doesn't include questions, but the people in the hall can ask whatever they like. So I'll come to Alice first. We've got Alice Bell, who's head of climate policy at the Wellcome Trust. She used to work for the charity Possible, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. She's been an academic at Imperial and Sussex. She is the author of Our Biggest Experiment. If you haven't read it, you should. It's a history of the climate crisis. I think it's available in the Wellcome collection shop. And she's going to talk to us about her experience of communicating climate change, and very importantly, what works and what doesn't work. Then we'll come to Arjun Kapoor. He's research fellow at the Centre for Mental Health Law and Policy of the Indian Law Society in India. He works in India. He's a trained lawyer and psychologist. His work focuses on community mental health, suicide prevention included, working with diverse communities through the implementation, the research, the capacity building, looking at law and policy reform as well. He's going to talk to us a great deal about language and mental health, which we look forward to. We've got Jennifer Catania, who is a producer, artist, researcher. She makes interactive experiences about food and the environment. She's looking at artistic approaches and how they can be beneficial in communicating stories about climate and health. She's going to talk to us about what she's been working on lately. So, we're going to start with Alice. I'd like to know, well, what's the Wellcome Trust doing in all of this? You know, the Wellcome Trust should be at the heart of this, isn't it? So what's happening?
Thank you. Well, the main thing that Wellcome are doing is being a health charity, a health practitioner, health funder, health research funder, interested in climate change. And that is no small thing. I've just got back from a summit in Geneva of health policy people, and it was striking that climate change kept coming up, but it felt new to them still. It's clear that lots of people in health are kind of aware that climate change is a thing, but they've thought for a while that someone else might sort that. That's for the climate people. They're the health people. And the same is true in the other side of it. I think, I've worked in climate change for a bit over a decade, before then in sort of science and environment policy at large, which included climate and health. And I've noticed in climate, like, if you're a climate activist like me, I'm kind of one of those people who, I used to have a colleague who said, when you start looking at the climate crisis, you can't look away. I'm like that. I'm a climate person now. Can't do anything else. And I spend a lot of time talking to climate people, as Fiona will have probably had similar experience. A lot of us get into this because we know it hurts, because we know it kills, because we find it terrifying in terms of human lives and human well-being. And yet we've kind of forgotten about that. Like, along the way, lots of climate people have kind of forgotten that that's what they do, because they've got pulled into talking about important, but in some ways sort of a niche aspect of it, of weighing up temperature and carbon emissions and thinking about the economic impact. So when we talk in a climate policy space about our decisions around climate change and why we're interested in it and what we're thinking about and what we're talking about, we talk about it in terms of numbers of degrees on a temperature scale, or kilograms of carbon dioxide, or kilograms of methane. Potentially we sometimes weigh it up in terms of economic impacts and financial flows, which is important, but we're not thinking about the impact on lives, and that's vital. And so the thing that Wellcome are doing is putting health at the heart of climate action. And so one of the things that we're doing as part of that is that we've helped create a kind of political space at the next UN climate talks, the COP of health. There's going to be a health day for the first time ever. I think it was probably the only bit of positive coverage about the COP that The Guardian has given so far. Maybe the last positive bit was, there's going to be a health day. So COPs are complicated beasts. This one, no less than any of the others, the ones that will be happening in Dubai in December. But they are important ones, and we're making sure that health is there. And as part of that, it's not just about putting up banners saying health and getting climate people to talk about health. It's ensuring that we do the work before then of getting the health community prepared to be able to understand climate and to be able to see it as a challenge that we're both involved in. So it's not something that, climate is one space, health on the other, and we occasionally talk to each other. These are cross-cutting problems. So when I talk to health people, I often say, like, the thing about climate change is it's a threat multiplier. It's not a distinct issue on its own. It just makes everything that we wanted to do harder. And so we have to see it as health people who are worried about eradicating particular diseases or maternal child health or gender equity and how that is affected by health challenges, all the different reasons why people are interested in health. We have to think about how climate is part of that. And so we need to do a lot of work preparing the health community to come there. So we're working in political spaces like that. We're also doing lots of work in cultural spaces. Alice and Harriet and other people in land biological ecologies work, but also I've got colleagues who work with people in television and media. We do a huge amount of community engagement, thinking about how health and climate can be combined, and we can put people and well-being back in the center of the climate conversation. A big part of what we do is we are a research funder, so at the heart of this is collecting research. And it's really striking that one of the problems that we've had, I think, in getting climate and health to talk to each other about climate policy is there are some huge knowledge gaps. There are huge things that we're just not measuring. So we know quite a lot about the health impacts of a heat wave in OAPs in Europe because of the 2003 heat wave that killed lots of people. So there was lots of research done on that. Slightly less research on the impact of a heat wave of a pregnant woman in Malawi. And yet, they are some of the most affected people. So one of the things we're doing at Wellcome is we're tracking out where are those research gaps, and we're coming at it very clearly from an equity point of view. How are those research gaps, not just gaps in knowledge, but gaps in resources, gaps in equality? How are they both patterned by the inequality that is causing the climate crisis and helping to continue those inequalities? And how can we intervene at a research level to ensure that we not only have more information so people like the World Bank can go, oh, I have data to do this, but that we have an equitable level of lever for that? It's something I think people don't always realize, but access to not just access to research evidence, but the ability to ask those questions and who is able to be the ones who chooses those research questions is crucial to how we then pattern public debate and the decisions that are made from them and the world that we can recreate from that. So that's a big part of one of the ways that we're intervening. And as I said, alongside all of that, it's thinking about equity, and it's thinking about the political structures that the climate crisis and the various health crises that intersect with it sit within. So I just want to finally say that when we talk about climate communications, we often talk about all the things that we've done wrong, all the things that scientists have done wrong. And that's true. There are lots of things that people have done wrong. But it is an incredibly hard challenge, and there were always going to be things that people have done wrong. And there have been, in the last 10 years, last 20, 30 years actually, think about climate change, you've got to remember that time catches up with you. But that's 30 years, sort of since the early 90s. There has been a strong concerted effort to take any tension, any problem in the climate space and make it into something bigger. This has been well documented by academics like Naomi Oreskes talking about the rise of the kind of climate skeptic movement. And that's, those sorts of, there are political actors out there to get us and to stop our action. And that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about, as well as many other types of political divides and different views in how we work. And as I said, these huge inequalities that are patterning it. So how can we make sure that our scientific research and our communications are fighting against those right from the get-go?
Thank you. That's brilliant, Alice. Thank you very much. And we'll get some more from you later. But I'm going to move on now to Arjun. Arjun, how do we talk to people about their mental health in the context of a changing climate?
Thanks, Fiona, for that beautifully complex question. Talking about language and mental health in 5 minutes is a pretty ambitious project because language and both mental health are, I think, fundamental aspects of the human condition, which are also extremely complex. So I'm going to try my best to lay down the terms of the discourse and the discussion. Maybe, hopefully, we can open it up later on. So Wittgenstein, I'm sure some of you are aware of him, one of the most well-known philosophers of language, famously said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And I find that to be an extremely compelling statement because it actually points to both the possibilities of language in terms of how language itself constructs our world and our experience of the world, but it also limits it at the same time. And that's really at the crux of the discussion around language and mental health, especially when we're speaking or talking to various and diverse communities across the world. Now, I'm not a name dropper. I don't know too many names, but another line which is stayed by me is by this psychoanalyst. My training is in psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic psychology, Jacques Lacan in France, who very famously said that the unconscious is actually structured like language. Extremely profound a statement. And when we're talking of the unconscious, we're of course talking about a constellation of our feelings, our desires, our emotions, our thoughts, which are both verbalized, not verbalized, conscious, unconscious. And all of these are actually constructed in the form of language. And what this really means is that, conventionally we believe that, we've sort of been conditioned to believe that language is a mode of communication or expression. But language is actually central to the construction of the human experience and of our emotional experiences. So we live in language. Our identities are formed in language. We don't live outside of language. But at the same time, there are limits to language and how we construct and conceive the world through language. And I wanted to just sort of foreground this fundamental point before we actually sort of move on and discuss the complexities around mental health and our feelings and emotions, and how do we deal with this? How do we communicate about this with people around us? Now, when we talk of mental health, historically, our understanding of mental health has been constructed through a biomedical framework, which has largely come through psychiatry, and Western psychiatry at that. And we've always sort of been familiarized and used diagnostic terms and parameters, so depression, anxiety, psychosis, schizophrenia. These are terms that we are very familiar with, but they've also come from a certain tradition and a certain legacy. And for good reason, and I'm not sort of discounting that, but I think the complication comes when we're actually speaking to communities, right? Because communities and we human beings don't live in diagnostic categories. Our experience isn't broken up into symptoms or specific diagnostic sort of classifications. We live complex lives, and we have complex emotions and experiences. And Thomas Sayers, who's one of the proponents of the anti-psychiatry movement, and just to be clear, I'm not anti-psychiatry, but again, he said something very interesting. He sort of course, questioned the very idea of mental illness, and he says that it's a myth. Mental illness is a myth. There are just people who have problems in living, right? So there is no mental illness. There are people who have problems in living. And I think that in a way also can sort of summarizes the challenge of the climate crisis, because it impacts our material realities in multiple ways. And we experience those realities in different ways, and we express and respond to those realities in a variety of ways, right? In the 1980s, medical anthropology gave us the phrase idioms of distress, right? Which is that we all have different ways of expressing our distress, and they're not always verbal, right? They're not always through words. A lot of those idioms are also expressed through the body, through bodily symptoms, especially in contexts where, for instance, where I come from in India, where talking about emotions and feelings is an extremely complex subject and often embargoed, because there's a lot of shame and guilt around actually talking about what you're going through. So in that context, the body becomes a conduit to express through its own language one's distress and experience. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that when we're engaging with communities, I think we need to be very careful that on the one hand there is science which gives us what Wittgenstein called language games, a whole set of rules and conventions and discourse around how to talk about mental health. But when we're actually talking to communities, we really need to speak the language of communities. And that can happen in multiple ways, through dialogue. It can happen through creative means, and I'm sure Jen will talk about that. And most importantly, I think we need to put in place infrastructures for developing modes of communication, whether it's translation, whether it's interpretation, whether it's how a psychiatrist in a clinic takes a case history from a patient and understands their narrative, and understands the nuances of their narrative, and how their idioms of distress are actually expressed and nuanced in their relationships, in their material realities, in the relationships of their communities with other communities, of conflict, and so on and so forth. And lastly, and I'll wrap up with this, is I think the fundamental question that some of us have to ask ourselves as people who are working in this space, who are coming from positions of privilege and power, is that, are we really listening? And if we are listening from our frames of reference and our frames of context, or are we suspending those and immersing ourselves in the lives of the communities and the people that we engage with, and engaging with them from their standpoint, from their frames of reference? So I'll stop here, and happy to open up after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, that was fascinating. And now we're going to hear from Jennifer Catania, as I said, who's a producer and artist working with food and the environment. So Jennifer, I think you've got some examples of you can show us how artistic approaches can work with communicating these stories. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, and definitely want to get into queer stuff too. Wait, is this on actually? Yeah. Okay. This is on. Okay. So yeah, I'm Jennifer. I'm a producer, researcher, artist, and I've been working with land body ecologies for the past couple years. You know, in my work as a producer, I will show you a little bit more. Please use your big, beautiful imaginations to imagine the picture that's flipped horizontal. Imagine that vertical. But yeah, so I work with studios and agencies to develop interactive experiences in the formats of AR, VR, installations, websites, games. And you know, my job is really to make the process of play and learning feel seamless and easy. It is very much not. And so a couple years ago, about 3 years ago, as an artist and human, I was interested in learning more about the environment and coffee, and met my collaborator, Siwakan Odachao, through a mutual friend, and visited his farm. And through that through that initial interest, as just an independent person not connected to any organization, I started working with him and learning more about growing and rotational farming practices, and at the same time met Vic and Kat through the Asia Europe Foundation, and you know, that's sort of how this whole collaboration with LBE started. And he actually, I was really nervous about speaking up here with, along all of my esteemed panelists, being someone who never studied the environment, doesn't work in it professionally, and is just someone who cares and is interested and is learning. And I asked him, just like, you know, I told him I was nervous, and he said, don't be nervous, because the real language, real communicating is laughing and crying. Everything else is extra. And when you're laughing and crying with people, that's when you're really connecting. And so that made me laugh. And I did cry just in that last session. And so through this process of working together, I'm gonna move on and I'll just speak a little bit more about his community. He's from the Karen community in northern Thailand, and they grow rice and a lot of different other things using rotational farming practices. but the government has banned a lot of the practice of this ancestral kind of farming. And so through this research, which we started during the pandemic, we did a lot of workshops to learn more from him and his father, who is an activist and was a central component of the Assembly of the Poor in Thailand back in the 60s, I believe. And we really spent a lot of time just working together, learning from each other, and creating workshops and podcasts and works of progress, really, to show the vibrant culture that's going on in his community that's been there for a really long time. And these are some drawings from the kids in his community to highlight the story of the orphan boy, which is like a very central story in his community, which I don't have time to tell now, but maybe later. And from that, because of my work in media production, I started thinking about the way that he walks through the forest and the wayfinding, because as someone who is from Los Angeles, has been living in Thailand, in Bangkok for the past 10 years, I recognize that I am an outsider that has more in common, more biases in common with a lot of the urban people that are making the environmental policies that are doing really disastrous things for his area. And so, I was thinking about the way that I find my way around the city, and I'm very addicted to Google Maps. And when I'm standing in the street, I'm looking down at the blue dot and then just turning around to see where the arrow is pointing me. And I'm completely disconnected from the environment and following this blue dot. And so I asked him, how does he navigate through the forest? And he talked about someone in his community who doesn't know how to read, doesn't know how to write, and can drive from from Chiang Mai all the way down to Bangkok in about 8 hours without ever looking at a map. And I just thought that was really interesting. And so I made like a very quick prototype to think about ways we can use those practices in new ways that we'll probably be finding in the future. Maybe, I don't know. But so yeah, on the right is a digital marker that is, it's difficult to hear, but there's a sound that Vic recorded. It's the sound of the inside of a tree. And because the way that he navigates through the forest, he takes he looks for landmarks. And it's difficult to find landmarks in cities with buildings that look kind of the same. So I thought, what would a digital landmark look like? And yeah, and the left is a prototype of ways to use landmarks to find your way around. But yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for showing us that. That was lovely. Brilliant. You're all doing fantastic work in communicating the climate crisis and health. But it does strike me that everything can get very gloomy very quickly, can't it, when we talk about climate and its nexus with health. It can seem hopeless. We're facing a very grim future. And of course, we've got to make sure that people are aware of how serious this is, how earth-threatening the climate crisis is. But also, we need to enable people to keep going and to do positive things and not feel overwhelmed by the enormity of what's happening. How do you balance that sort of tension between hope and fear? I'll come to you first, actually, Arjun. I mean, this is this is something you deal with every day.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. No pressure.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the work that I and the organization that I'm associated with and my colleagues do is actually what I like to say, building communities of care and resilience. A lot of our work is actually about increasing access to mental health support and care through informal mechanisms. because our belief is that not everybody who's experiencing distress has to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And of course, in countries like India, there is a massive, massive deficit, human resource crunch, or a crisis of having adequate mental health professionals who are actually out there providing support. But beyond that, I think communities themselves are an immense source of support, and actually know best how to support their own people. So what we essentially do is create sort of mechanisms, support communities to develop interventions, bring in some know-how around supporting people with, say, distress, or people who might be experiencing suicidal feelings, and sort of co-design, co-build these interventions with them, implement them, right? But I think the fundamental point here is really for us to act as facilitators, because it would be extremely patronizing for us to think that communities need to be taught, to be resilient. People are surviving on a daily basis, despite all odds, and they rely on both individual sort of resources and community resources to deal with these daily struggles that one is experiencing. So I think there is a lot of hope, and in fact, our work is founded on hope. The idea that you can overcome, you can recover from the distress that you're experiencing. But I think there are challenges, especially around, say, in countries like India, where, again, like I said, there is a lot of stigma around just talking about mental health. So I think a lot of work goes into facilitating those conversations and normalizing those conversations to say that this is as important, mental health is as important as your physical health. And that it has implications for your physical health as well, and that it's okay to talk about your feelings, that it's not a sign of weakness, but it is okay to talk about your vulnerability. And yeah, in our experience, of course, we find that, and there's evidence now to sort of suggest through our work that communities are receptive, and they have incredible amounts of resources to be able to support their own people. So I think the discourse is founded on the premise of hope and recovery, and the fact that we need to build infrastructures of care and support within communities. And here I mean everybody, from school teachers. We work with school teachers in rural settings to prevent adolescent suicides. We work with community volunteers in village settings. We work with young people in colleges and institutions to provide support to their own peers, especially say if they're experiencing suicidal thoughts or feelings. And the amazing thing about this is that when we work with communities, we find that communities come with a whole, a complete sort of, they have the infrastructures of hope and support already built in. I think it's just a question of facilitating those pathways and facilitating those spaces where all of that can actually happen. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, you seem to manage to inject some joy and hope into your work.
I think this work is like any work. It's built on relationships and is built on finding those moments of trust and joy. And this is such a long-term process. We really can't do without joy, and I think there's so much joy in connection, and that just requires time to really spend with someone, not about any particular subject. I think just talking shit, hanging out, and, teaching each other to cook and finding conversations along the way instead of conversation being the point, I think is so important. And I think art is such a great foundation for those kinds of very loose, building that surface area and having foundation be built on top of that without any real intention. I think it's very important to have those structures that make sure that the relationship is equitable. But I think the relationship between people, yeah, that really can't be measured. You kind of just have to want to and do it, I guess. So that is it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very
for
much.
sharing.
Alice, sometimes people get accused when we talk about sort of hope in relation to the climate crisis. Sometimes people are rather dismissive of that. They call it hopium. How do you manage this?
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember some of the "we've got to have hope" rhetoric on the run up to the Copenhagen talks, which was quite painful at the time, and looking back is even more painful. We've got to have hope, but it just sort of seems really desperate. I used to work at Science Museum doing kids shows, and I remember once being like, "We're going to have fun, kids," and I could just feel like how those words being ash in my mouth, like some of the stuff that was climate change. But I think you build your own hope. You know, that's the way to make sure it's not empty. You have to take action. And I think we have to remember the resources that we have. So a few years ago, I wrote this book on the history of the climate crisis, and I spent several years reading all these different ways in which people had discovered all the different things that helped us understand this thing we now call the climate crisis, and all the ways in which we had taken a long time to actually do anything about it. You know, Congress was first briefed on this thing we now call the climate crisis in 1956. This is a long time ago. You know, Thatcher convened her cabinet to be briefed on it, and then gave several speeches on the topic in the 1980s. This is a long time ago. And I thought I'd get to the end of writing this book, and I'd just be really depressed. And actually, weirdly, I got to the end of writing this book, and I don't know if it was because it was the middle of a heat wave and I was going a little bit, just sort of, my brain was a bit scattered. But actually, what I've seen is that people have worked together across the world through generations, being able to do something as amazing as discovering the climate crisis, because it's not obvious climate change. Like, we could just be sitting here going, "Oh, the weather's a bit hot again," but we haven't. We actually know that. We've got all these incredible techniques to discover that. And going to this new role at Wellcome, I thought, I'm going to be even more depressed because health is the most depressing end of the impacts of climate change. And I was like, okay, yeah, there is lots of things. We have to remember how depressing this is, and we have to share these terrible stories, and we have to make sure that we're rooted in reality. But at the same time, health is one of the best things that people do as humanity. Health research, our ability to understand the human body, our ability to collect together to produce something as wonderful as a hospital which saves lives, like, that is some of the best stuff that we can do. And if we can channel this best of humanity and share it, because that's the thing that's most depressing in all of this, is how unequally it's shared. But if we can share these resources, then we can protect ourselves. You know, we've got one of the challenges with climate change is that it's not a problem that you can solve. You can't eradicate climate crisis in the same way as you could imagine eradicating polio or smallpox. We're stuck with that, with a lot of it already. We're stuck with the warming that we're living at the moment. But we can, if we act, stop too much more from happening, and we can protect more people than we currently are from the dangers that we've got. We know what a lot of those dangers are, and we are at a position, depressingly, where a lot of people are already dying, will continue to die, and continue to suffer in lots of other ways. But we have got loads of resources to protect more people than we currently are protecting. And if we can hold on to the fact that we can utilize this wonderful thing that humans do. Humans are terrible, awful people who have created the climate crisis and lots of structures around it, but we are also amazing beings that can work together and be creative and can look after each other. And that's I guess, the thing that keeps me going, in as much as there is something. But ultimately, it often can feel a bit like ash words in your mouth when you talk about hope and climate change, because it is depressing.
Well, it's true, yes. Okay, I'm going to invite our audience to make some interventions, ask some questions. Now, there's a microphone, I think, which we will get to you. I've got a question here. What you can do is, I'm very happy for you, if you don't want to ask a question, you can just make a point, make an intervention, just say, oh, I'd like to say this, and that's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be framed as a question. It's down here. I think there's a question down here. So feel free to do that. But also, please do try to make your questions or interventions to the point and fairly kind of brief, so we can get on with this. Yes, hello.
I'd like to really personalise this, because you've been talking about communities and so on. I just want to talk about, so I live around the corner from here, and so the block I live in, we bid for an air quality monitor, and it's really terrible. We're about 3 times WHO levels. And so in the London Climate Action Week, we're going to do a walk across Bloomsbury to see some good stuff and some terrible stuff. And you know what? It's so difficult to share this. And that's what I want to ask you about. It's kind of like, so it's an emergency, I really do believe, but the local MP, Keir Starmer, didn't even reply to the invitation, didn't even say he wasn't going to come. Lots of the councillors, they they say that they may or may not respond, but they don't actually do anything. Can't get any press coverage for it. So we're going to make a film and show that. But I want to, because people are busy doing other stuff, because it's not actually killed them right this second. And so they just, no, I've got other things to do. I want to ask you about that.
Thank you. That must be very distressing, actually. And yeah, I mean, I think there is, unfortunately, a pattern of people in authority not responding to these issues. So I think that is that must be very difficult. And perhaps there are other ways in which it's possible to communicate this. We're also having, after this session, it will be possible to meet in the Williams Lounge and talk about some of these issues. So that might be helpful too. I'm going to take questions just in collections of about 3 to give to our panelists. So if we've got another question, I'll take sort of 3 at once. We've got a question here and one at the back. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Like, it was super interesting. And the way in which we talk about the climate crisis and the very way in which it's framed, if we think about it as a disease, is that we should mitigate its symptoms rather than addressing the root cause of the problem, which is the way in which we live and the very structure of our society and economic system. So in terms of narratives, how can we shift the focus of the discussion from trying to continue our living as usual, mitigating the symptoms of the crisis, towards actually starting a discussion, a public communication on the root cause of the problem? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So looking to the root cause of the problem there. We had a question down here. If we could have the microphone here. There's a lady here. Just there. And then I can see other questions, but I'll take you in the next batch.
Thank you so much to all of you. I've done a lot of work on using art as a form of translation for climate change communication. And in my own work, and what I've also heard from all of you, and specifically Jennifer, was the translation to a more urban setting. And kind of, I've also experienced at the LB conference this week, is that there's a form of art as a communication tool to an urban setting where there might be disconnect from where a lot of these issues are really happening. I guess I'm wondering, where do you feel the art is most effective in communicating? Is there a role for this also in the communities or places where you're maybe collecting the information from or doing the more on-the-ground work?
Great, thank you very much. So a question on where this can be most effective in terms of art and communication. A question about addressing the root causes, and a question about what's happening with air quality. Jennifer, that was a very specific question directed at you, so I'll take you first.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I definitely think that there's a role for it, depending on who the audience is. I think the LB is specifically positioned to be geared towards policymakers. I mean, I think in that sense, Alice, you might have a little bit more to say about that. But in terms of art as a tool for communication within community, I can tell you a little bit more about the virtual art workshop that we did during the pandemic and what happened when we came back. And we showed all these videos of how we use that art. So we use that art as we made an animation and kind of digitize all those assets to recreate the orphan story, and showed it to all the kids. And I mean, it was a trip that I took just myself, but it was it was a nice moment to show that all the research that's being collected is going back to the community, and it was more a step in a continuing relationship, because I know in a lot of research sometimes, well, I mean, I don't know if a lot of research, maybe you both can tell me more about that, but I do always wonder what happens to the research. How is this research being used, and how much of the, how much sign-off do the communities get? And I think art as a way to kind of cut through the academic language some of this research presents as, and really show just the results of that length of time that you spent together. And so on a community setting, I'm not the best person to answer that, if I'm being perfectly honest, but I'm answering from my own perspective. This is kind of, they were excited to see it, and it led to more honest conversations on a personal level, and that leads to other things. But on a conference level, can I kick it to you, Alice?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting point that you bring up. And I think it's really, there is understandably quite a lot of attention when it comes to climate change discussions put on urban spaces, partly because they're often a centre of a lot of the problems, causing a lot of the problems. But also, as our first question came from, they are a place where you're seeing a lot of intersecting problems, impacts as well, negative impacts. And they are sites of huge inequality. They are sites where we're seeing, places like New York, rich country, and yet some of the most impacted on climate change and very climate vulnerable people, partly because of, legacies of particularly racism in the States and lots of inequalities, and like talking to some of the root causes question as well. And yet, that's not the only place where climate change impacts are happening or climate change causes are happening either. And I think one of the big gaps that climate change policy people, but all the other different people who think about climate change need to really be aware of, are the cultural and political gaps that are increasing between urban and rural areas. And one of the things I think, if we're being clever about it, about the sorts of tactics we need to take in terms of tackling the climate challenge, it's not just thinking we need to do this work in cities, because that's really important. I mean, in networks like C40 cities, which bring together mayors across the world, think about things like the Urban 20, which is bringing together kind of G20 urban spaces and stuff like that. We also need to be thinking about, or we need to have an agricultural strategy and think about rural communities. We need to be thinking about how we bring people together, because the cultural gaps between people, even within countries, is a huge challenge for getting any of this done. And a big part of that come down to people identifying as either rural or urban, and a sense of justifiably sometimes inequality around our thinking about that. So I think one of the things we really need to tackle, and I don't have answers to it yet, but it's definitely something I'm planning to think more about, and I want to encourage other people to think about more, is how we don't just think about the two distinct areas, but how we can bring those people together.
Thank you very much. Arjun, I'll bring you in here.
Yeah, I'd just like to maybe respond to each of the questions. Just to start with your question, I come from Delhi, and in the past 10 years, Delhi is a virtual gas chamber. I think pollution levels in Delhi have probably broken the SPM meter levels, and we see this year after year. And I shouldn't say this, but don't make a trip to Delhi in the winter, because all you're going to see is a yellow haze, which literally looks apocalyptic, right? And it's terrible, it's awful. But year after year, we hear people groaning and moaning about it, but nothing really happens. And that is a question of political apathy. And to be honest, I don't know the solution to that. We do need to think of communicating with policymakers in more effective ways, and we have to think of what's going to work, what's not going to work. I think we do need to focus on that. But connected to that, I also want to bring up an important point which also touches upon not the root causes, because I'm not a climate expert, and I don't even know I don't know if we've reached a point of no return, whether we can actually address those root causes. But I think there is a fundamental problem of how even the climate crisis is, like all other humanitarian crises or social justice issues, is going to reproduce social inequalities. And there will be some communities, and this is affecting everyone, right? So I think yesterday in one of the panels, there was a question about how do you measure pain, and everybody is experiencing pain and is going to be affected by it. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there will be some communities who are structurally marginalized and excluded, who will face the brunt, the maximum brunt, because there is a crisis of accessibility, because there is a crisis of infrastructure. And I think that's something that we need to address, because climate change and its effects are going to happen. It's taken for granted. And I think we need to put in place mitigation measures to provide psychosocial care to people, to ensure housing, employment, social security. People are going to be displaced. There's going to be a whole range of collateral, I hate using the word collateral, but there's going to be a whole range of impacts on people. And just to give you an example, every year in Delhi, when it turns into a gas chamber, you will find, of course, the minority privileged elite folks who will all suddenly flock to shops and buy air purifiers and keep them in their rooms, right? Now, that's the kind of, that's the contradiction and paradox that I think we need to address, that there are structural inequalities which are going to get reproduced. And how are we then addressing the impact on those communities who don't have access to simple basic services, right? And that's very much part of the climate crisis, as it is of any other humanitarian crisis that we experience on this planet. And coming to your question about art, so there is some scientific research about, so one of the biggest challenges, at least in the context of mental health and even public health, is to ensure behavioral change outcomes, right? And here communication becomes really critical in terms of how do you communicate science, right, to people in a way which can, which they're able to understand and connect with and relate to. And I think art over there has an extremely important role in being able to communicate the complexities of science to people in simple ways. And the Wellcome Collection is an example of this, and so is the Land Body Ecology's sort of whole project, which is looking at cultural symbols and artifacts and creating those different languages that people can actually understand. But I think we need more research on this. We, for instance, use community theater and other forms to communicate some of the work that we're doing or the interventions that we're developing for ensuring behavioral change outcomes. But I think we need more research to really understand what works, what doesn't work, in what context, what needs to be adapted. So I think there is a lot of potential there, and maybe we need to be focusing more on this from a research point of view across contexts.
Can I say something very quickly about air quality? In that, one of the things that I find really amazing about this history and story of air pollution is for how long people have put up with it. Like, you look at the coal pollution in London in the 19th century. London was famous for the smog and everything. People would laugh about it. Victorians hated dirt, but they saw coal dirt as somehow good because it was good for the economy, and they literally just like, saw through it. Like, people were falling over in the streets. People were walking into traffic. They were walking into the river. That's why they have the rails by the river and by traffic. It's because people were walking into it. My mum remembers this growing up in London in the 50s, and yet we put up with it. And then we cleaned up the air pollution in London to some extent just by the fact that we moved over to gas and oil, and we sort of shifted how we made gas heating in the UK because of the economic advantages and technological changes in offshore oil and gas. But now we've got these other challenges again, and yet it's still nothing compared. Like similarly, I live in central London and I work next door. I literally have, and I've just been diagnosed with asthma. I'm feeling the same thing, but it's nothing compared to Delhi. And I do think, though, we're starting to get a little bit more of a conversation about it, and it's not just going to be a matter of waiting until someone comes up with an economic advantage for us to shift. We're going to shift for the health reasons, I hope. It's going to take a long time, and we have to keep pointing out. But, Sadiq Khan, there's lots of things we can criticise him with on air pollution, but he does still also seem to be getting and talking about it. And I think we need to lean into where people are talking about it while still challenging them on where they're not there. And I know it's hard, but it's just we have to keep slogging through it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Those were great answers and great questions. We can take some more questions. So we've got one at the back here. We've got one at the front. We had another one in the middle that I didn't get to before. Has your question been answered, or would you like to ask it again? Yes, please. Thank you. And then here. So if there's another question, put your hand up now so I can see. Right, I'll take you and you after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel, but especially to the questioner on root causes, given that those root causes cause a lot more problems than just climate change. Climate is a nebulous word, hard to communicate. It doesn't exist in many cultures and languages. I'm just curious why we refer to the climate crisis rather than the overconsumption crisis or the human values crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's it. Yeah, go ahead, Kat. That's a great question. That is a great question. Thank you. We've got a question here, and we've got two questions. Put your hand up again here, and there was another one in the middle. I said I'd take. Yeah, so you too. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. First off, I just wanted to say to Arjun, I completely relate to the air pollution growing up in Delhi. And yes, here is nothing compared to AQI hitting 999 and breaking the air quality monitors 2 years in a row. But my question is for Jennifer. So at the moment, I work at the intersection of technology in the visual storytelling and sustainability sphere. And, you know, we do reports, we do data visualizations, we try to communicate the impacts of climate change to stakeholders and those who are responsible. And I'm really interested in the idea of using new technologies such as AR and VR in doing that. But then again, that brings me to question the technological inequality that we see within countries. They could relate to censorship, or in some countries even ChatGPT is censored. So it's just a question of how do you use technology to bridge the gap between climate communication when one part, those that are affected, don't even have access to those technologies. I could have probably framed that better, but I hope that gives you a broad framework.
Lovely, thank you. Jennifer, I'll put that question to you in a moment about using technology for this storytelling. There was a question here, and then one here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much, especially Arjun, thank you for speaking about language. I think that's something that really isn't touched on enough, that language doesn't keep up with the pace of climate change. My question is, I guess, sort of an invitation. I'd love to hear from each of you. If there was one thing everyone in this room could do when they leave today, what would you suggest?
That's a great question, and I'm going to save that as the last one. You, sir, we've got a microphone for you.
Hi, hello. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm not excellent at public speaking, so do bear with me. Thank you all for your time and being here today. I do have a question, mostly for Jennifer, but I'd be more than happy to hear from the rest of you, of course. You mentioned something at the very beginning, Fiona, and it got me thinking. I work as a video game producer for a external provider, I suppose, of ADR dialogue for video game motion performance capture pipelines for animation. And you mentioned, you know, what these mediums are doing to flag the change in climate, you know. And it clicked. It dawned on me that I'm working currently on a lot of video games that are all based in a not too distant future, and it's all bleak and gloom and dystopian and gross. And it got me thinking, is there a collective or group, to your knowledge, for producers and other creatives looking to collaborate to create and produce games that are AR, MR, VR, or other interactive experiences for the younger generation? Because I imagine, you know, creating experiences in games that are cool and fun for the younger generation isn't easy. And if there is, I'd be very much interested in joining, really, or collaborating and working with people to create these experiences.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, I will ask our panelists if they know of any such things. Okay, so video games, if you know of that. Jennifer, you've got a very specific question about using technology and AI. This is a crisis of consumption rather than just of the climate. And then there's that final question, one thing for everyone to do. So I'd like each of you to give me definitely your answer to that last question. And Jennifer, I'll start with you because there was a specific question to you.
I'm really sorry. We are out of time, and we do have another talk coming in, and our interpreters who need to rest. There is space for the refreshments outside if you want to carry on the questions and the answers outside.
Okay, all right. Sorry, because we started 5 minutes late, so I thought that we have 5 minutes for
okay.
Right.
If you think you can answer the questions in 5 minutes, then that's there.
Yes. Very, very quickly, Jennifer.
So my answer is I can't answer that in 5 minutes, but if you want to meet me over there, I'd love to speak more about that. I have definitely a lot of thoughts, and I have some links for you if you both want to talk after.
Yeah. one thing that our audience can do? Arjun?
Ilan, I completely agree. The climate crisis is ultimately a social justice issue, which has to deal with communities and peoples and the relationships between them and the inequalities between them. One thing that we can do as a mental health person or a practitioner, listen and learn to listen. That's all I can say, yeah.
Lovely.
My one thing, also I might have some links for you as well, so we can talk later. The people always say, what's the one thing I can do? Thing is, we all need to do lots of things. We all need to do all of the things, and those will be different for different people. I'm going to guess that if you're in this room here, you are more likely to be a middle-class person living in the UK, but that's not necessarily true. But for those of you who are, you need to think about your consumption. That's a big part of it. But that's the first time. So the thing I'd say for everyone is, like, the general rule is do something that brings you joy. Because there's all sorts of things we need to do and we need to change in our lives, and there's lots of different things that will be different for different people. And we're not going to stick at the thing that we hate. And we're not going to be infectious about the thing that we hate. It's a bit like when you're like, oh, I need to do some exercise. Don't go running every day if you hate running. Do swimming because you love swimming. You'll stick with that. Same is true for climate action. Do the thing that gives you joy because you'll stick at it. But also, it's the thing that you'll be most infectious of, because it's not just the thing that you do, it's how you bring other people with you. So there will be, for all of you, a different model of all of the billion of things that you all need to do. You've got to start somewhere. Start with the thing that brings you joy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. As we've just been told, we can go to the...
I forgot to add mine. Mine was ask good questions, which requires good listening and joy. Okay.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, our audience are very good at asking questions. I'm afraid we've not been quite so good at answering them in the time available. But there is, as you've just heard, the opportunity to go to the Williams Lounge on this floor for further discussion. And I would just like to say thank you to all of you for coming and taking part. Thank you to the people who are watching on the live stream. And thank you most of all to our fantastic panel. Thank you.